Okay, yep, it's full. Okay, it's time to begin our Bible study. If you'd like to open your Bibles up to Daniel chapter 6, that's where we're going to be today. We'll cover chapter 6 today, and then I've got a task to cover the next 6 chapters in 3 weeks. They're all visions. Since I don't understand one of them very much at all, I get through that chapter really quick. So if we go through that and you say go through it really quick, it went through it really quick because I really don't understand it myself. So, but we'll we'll do the best we can do to yeah, right. We'll do the best we can do to get through those. I told Kyle last night, he's at the house, I said, I think you're going to have to teach one of these chapters because I don't understand it. So before we begin our study, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we're thankful for this day, for the blessing that we have together with fellow Christians to spend time in study of your word. We're thankful for the guidance that it provides us. We pray that we'll strive to live our lives by it. We ask you to be with those that are leading classes this morning, and they might be able to present the things they've studied, and that it might be edifying, encouraging, and informative to us. We're thankful for the blessing we have to be at this congregation. We pray that you'll continue to watch over us as we strive to serve you. Bless all the members here and their various works. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. So we're covering something today that most of you know very well. Daniel in the lion's den. So I was trying to think, what am I going to do actually today to make this interesting? So I asked Crosby last night, I said, Crosby, can you tell me the story of Daniel's in the lion's den? So I've got to relay the story that he told me. Well, Daniel went to pray, and the king told him he couldn't. I can't get it all exactly right in his animation. I sure can't get right. But Daniel went to pray, and the king told him he couldn't do it, so he threw him in the pit, in the den, in the lion's den. But God shut up the mouth of the lions, And then the king run out and took him out of the pit. And then his brothers sold him to a group of people, and they went into Egypt. And that was the story of Daniel. So we got a little bit of Joseph and Daniel together. But that's the 7 or 8 year old version. He's now 8. That's the 8-year-old version of Daniel in the lion's den. So then I asked Bailey, and I got a very detailed analysis of that. And so she said that the king had an edict or a decree, and Daniel violated that by praying. And the king, even though he didn't want to, threw him into the lion's den. And hers was more lengthy than that, threw him in the lion's den. But God shut the mouth of the lions, and he was just there chilling with the lions. So when the king came to get him out. So now you have the 8-year-old version and the 13-year-old version of Daniel in the lion's den. So it is a story that we're all familiar with. Now I was thinking, so how do you make this interesting? I mean, I can walk through that story and pretty quickly, and we're done. But what struck me in studying it this time wasn't just the fact that Daniel in the lion's den story, which we all know, but it was the character of Daniel and some of his characteristics. And that's what struck me in this study. So there's 2 people that we're going to talk about in this study a lot today. It's going to be Daniel and it's going to be the king. And they're quite different, but there's some characteristics that Daniel lived by and his life mimicked that we need to be doing today. So you all know the mouth of the lion was shut, but we're going to try today to understand a little bit about the man that got thrown into the pit. And that's my goal today, or thrown into the lion's den. I keep using the pit because that's what one of the versions use. I want to set the stage a little bit here to look at this. This is a slide I showed last week, and I told you that we're not so chronological, but I want to show you where we're at today in the study. So we go back to chapter 5 at verse 30. And Belshazzar had seen the handwriting on the wall in chapter 5, what we studied 2 weeks ago. The handwriting on the wall said that the Babylonian the Babylonian Empire was over. Basically, that's what it said. For all the reasons that we discussed, I'm not going to go back through that. It says that very night, when the handwriting on the wall was seen, and Daniel told him that God was going to take the kingdom away from him, thus the end of the Babylonian Empire, and it occurred that very night. It was taken over by Darius the Mede. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom. It says he's 62 years old. Chapter 9, I think it's chapter 9 and verse 1. Maybe we can look and see. Chapter 9 and verse 1 it talks a little bit about who he was. So Darius the Mede it's now a part of the Medo-Persian Empire. Yes, it is 9 in chapter 9, verse 1. But it's now the Medo-Persian Empire. So the Babylonian Empire, which everything that we've studied up to this point is now over, and Darius the Mede is taken over. There's a lot of conversation about Darius the Mede and who he was, and he obviously was a Mede. There is a Darius who was a king in Persia. This is not the same Darius. This Darius the Mede probably, after all my study, there's a lot of people about it, but my study, I feel like probably Darius the Mede was under Cyrus, the Persian king, and Darius probably served by being king of the Babylonian area that was conquered. That would not be an unusual way for them to set up authority. But it doesn't really matter if that's the case or not. It's a Medo-Persian Empire. It's the second empire that was talked about in the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream in the 2nd chapter. We're going to get to that a little bit next week as well when we talk about that. But Darius is now in charge. I find it interesting that Darius is in charge and Daniel is still in a prominent position. So that's the way that this begins. Now think about what's happened in Daniel's life up to this point. So in chapter we learn that Daniel is brought into captivity in 606 BC. He's brought into captivity as a very young person, a young man. He was tested very early in his life about his faithfulness to God. He was asked to eat some things he probably would have been forbidden to eat, and he said, no, we're not going to do that. He, along with his counterparts, said they're not going to do that. And God delivered them, and as a result of that, they looked more healthy. So Daniel is a young person at that time. He's a young man who has been taken into captivity in 606 BC. The full captivity of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple didn't occur until 586 BC, but Daniel was already there, and captivity had begun in 606 BC for Daniel. Daniel was ruled, from that point, he was given a prominent position. And his three counterparts were given prominent positions. They were cast in the fiery furnace for serving God. But now we've come to the point that this captivity is about over. So it's lasted almost 70 years, about 68 years. So now, what is Daniel? He's an old man at this point. And it just struck me, the first thing in thinking about the character of Daniel, the first thing that struck me is that he had been in a prominent position for 60 plus years. For 60 plus years. I don't know when this actually occurred that he was young, so I'm saying 60 plus years. He's been in a prominent position through two different kingdoms now. And it says, later we'll see, he went ahead and served beyond even Darius as well. So there's a consistency with Daniel. I just want you to understand what age he is at this point. Sometimes people think about Daniel being thrown in the lion's den as a young man. He wasn't. He was thrown in the lion's den as an older man. And that's sometimes different than what we think about. So we can already see something about the character of Daniel, and that he had been, in fact, in a leadership position through the Babylonian Empire into the Medo-Persian Empire. So if we look at first chapter 6, beginning at the beginning, we see about Darius and the way that he set up the organization. He had set up a whole 120 satraps. I don't want to go through all things, but in chapter 2, in verse 2, it says that he had 3 governors. He had 3 governors that he put over all these, and this is the way he was ruling the kingdom. And Daniel was one of those 3. So Daniel was one of the 3 major leaders underneath Darius the king in what is now a conquered Babylon. Very prominent position. Daniel, it says, distinguished him success. He distinguished himself. It says he has an excellent spirit that was in him. So when you think about Daniel as a person, as an individual, separate from his affiliation with God and his loyalty to God, he was successful. Think about that. He was taken into captivity as a Jew. He was successful in what he had accomplished in terms of being a leader. And not only that, he had distinguished himself. It says that he had an excellent spirit. And I think you can probably go back and see what that means in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 12. It talks about his abilities to interpret, his abilities to tell the kings of the visions that they were seeing, of the dreams that they had. Of course, guided by God. We all know that he was guided by God. But think about Daniel. Successful in a political sense, if we could say it that way, as a leader. Distinguished. An excellent spirit. We'll find out later, very loyal to the king. So he distinguished himself, and then this is the part that I find so incredibly interesting, and it's one of those things, you've all done it. You read through a chapter, you read through the Bible, and then all of a sudden you read through something and you see it for the first time, even though you've read it a bunch of times. And I probably got to this chapter and just go through it really quickly in my daily reading when this comes up, because I know the story of Daniel in the lion's den, and then I catch this in verse 4. So some people were looking to find a charge against Daniel. Doesn't that happen? Just simple jealousy. Just simple jealousy. So the other leaders, I don't know, it says some of the governors and satraps, I don't know, it probably wasn't all of them, but there were some of them that were, and they were jealous of Daniel. So they thought to see if they could find something to accuse Daniel of. There's something that they wanted to accuse him, but they couldn't find anything wrong with him. It says in verse 4, concerning the kingdom, so not concerning religion, concerning the kingdom, they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. Think about that. Think about that. They couldn't find anything relative to Daniel and his work and his life to accuse him of that the king would find wrong. So that tells you that he was good at what he did. He was loyal at what he did. And I just think about it sometimes for us. I couldn't help but reflect on this as an elder, and I have to say, it gave me pause. It says I should be found blameless. Daniel was found blameless. He was found blameless. Have you ever thought about that, about Daniel? Think about how long he served now. Think about it. This is an older man, I won't say old, an older man, and he's found blameless. Successful, a leader, distinguished. The jealous people try to find something wrong with it, and they couldn't find anything wrong with Daniel relative to what he was doing. Think about the character of a person that can be described that way. I couldn't be described that way. I couldn't be described this way. I find it amazing, given his age, given his tenure of service to kings, that this is what they found. Now, they're really angry with him. They're really jealous of him. So do you think that they looked hard to find something, or they just said, we really can't find anything wrong with Daniel? We're not told, but I got to believe to what they wanted here, they were looking really hard to find something wrong with Daniel. And they couldn't find anything wrong with Daniel. What a character. What a characteristic to be able to describe somebody. Well, they did find something wrong at the end of the day. They thought, well, there's one thing we can do in verse 5. We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning what? The law of God. I know where we can get Daniel. We can get Daniel because of his faithfulness to his God. That's how we can get him. We can't get him based on the way he works. We can't get him based on the way he lives. We can't get him based on the way he served the king. But hey, we can get him based on his faithfulness to God, to his God. Sometimes I think in this life, don't you feel a bit threatened because of your faithfulness to God? Maybe with your peers, maybe with your friends. I would hope that one of the things that could be said about me would be, he's good, but when it comes to God, his God, when it comes to the way the life he wants to live, he's not. We can trap him there. We can trap him there. That's what they found. Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great to have the kind of life that somebody says, the only thing we can find wrong with you is the way you serve your God. The only thing we can find wrong with you is the way you serve your God. So we're going to find out some way to get you in that way. We're going to find out some way to get you by your service to God. And it happens sometimes. It happens sometimes. I'm sure we've all been in situations where we felt like, and you're faced with this dilemma, knowing that somebody's just trying to get you to do something you shouldn't do. Somebody's trying to get you to say something you shouldn't say. Somebody's going to try to get you to forsake your God. So you say, yeah, I get it. But I really can't think of that. But I think it's, do some people tempt you to do things you shouldn't do? Do some people try to get you to not come to worship? Do some people try to do it? Who's at work behind all this anyway? Satan's after us. He used those people to try to get to Daniel. Daniel relied on God. That same Satan's still active today, trying to get us and people around us to get us to do things that we shouldn't do, to live the kind of life we shouldn't live. So it doesn't seem so far-fetched when you think about life today for us. So what they said is, hey, I know how we can get Daniel. We can get Daniel because he is faithful to his God. So then things go in motion to try to figure out how to do that. So they've decided that's how we're going to get Daniel. That's the characteristic. So the governors, and I'm going in verse 6, I'm not going to read all these. They come in and they praise King Darius at the end of verse 6. They praise him, so they're trying to set themselves up right. And he said they're going to play on King Darius's sense of wanting to have a position of authority, to be worshipped, however you want to say it. So they encourage him to establish, in the middle of verse 7, establish a royal statute to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. So they come in and they appeal to Darius as king and to his sense of pride and to his sense of wanting to be worshipped. And they say, so let's just have this decree that if anybody worships anybody for you, besides you, that they're going to be cast in the den of lions. I would guess most of you know that, right? That's part of the story. You know what struck me in this, when I read this time? How long did they want that to happen? How long? 30 days. Don't you find it interesting that they knew that it would only take 30 days to get Daniel to violate this decree? It's not like they said, let's just make this. When you think about the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar, they wanted to make it a permanent. You can go to Esther and think about Esther, what Haman did with Mordecai, trying to make it permanent. In the case of Daniel, they said, hey, he's so faithful to his God, we only need 30 days, and he'll violate this. And I never picked that up studying before. It only takes 30 days for Daniel to violate. King, in verse 8, established the decree and signed the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of Medes and Persians, which does not alter. So some of your Bibles may have the reference to Esther there that I just referred to that you could read about. But that was the law, that once the king put something in writing and sealed it, that he couldn't alter it at that point. So Darius signed the written decree. So now they've achieved what they've wanted to achieve. They've now got a place where Daniel is going to have to make a choice, right? He's going to have to make a choice. He's got to choose to either serve the king or violate this decree and serve God. So, to reiterate what we've said at this point, a successful man, now aged, who has distinguished himself because of the Spirit that's within him, which is the Spirit of God. They find no fault in his life on earth that they can criticize him enough to get him cast into the den of lions, but they find the fault for him, and that he's going to always be faithful to his God. I don't think for a minute that they thought Daniel was going to do anything other than be faithful. I really don't think they did. Why would they go to this trouble? Why would they approach a king? They did that because they knew where Daniel's choice was going to lie. They knew, and they knew it would happen soon. This is not something they had to get the king to agree to make some kind of proclamation for a long period of time. 30 days. 30 days. So they've now got the trap set for Daniel. So you know what he does. He immediately violates the decree. Daniel knew that the writing was signed. In verse 10, he went home and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed, gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Daniel immediately went in to pray. He went home. He went to pray. He did it in the open. He wasn't trying to hide his faith and his loyalty to his God. He knelt, as was what? As was what? His custom. The way he normally did it. That's what he did. Did Daniel do anything different to defy this decree? No, he didn't. He actually didn't. Sometimes we make the story sound like he went and prayed just to violate the decree, just to prove that he's loyal to God. Daniel didn't do that. He actually didn't do that. What he did is what he always did. It was his custom. Daniel's worship was intentional. It was routine. It wasn't by accident. It wasn't to defy the king. Daniel did what he always did. Daniel did what he always did. I tell you, there's a whole bunch of lessons for me in this one part of this lesson. A whole bunch of lessons for me. My worship needs to be intentional. It needs to be routine. It needs to be planned. It needs to be expected. It doesn't need to be occasionally when it's convenient. Daniel's worship was routine. It was intentional. I think it's important. It's important to know that your worship is intentional. I had someone that Regina and I were having dinner with recently, who probably paid us a great compliment without intending to pay us a great compliment, and I'm glad that they could pay it without full intention, and I guess, agnostic at best and atheist possibly, not. And the comment was, well, we knew we couldn't do this on Sunday. That's all I needed to hear, because we know you're involved with your church. Probably thinks it's crazy, but that's fine. People need to know that we've got a routine. People need to know that our worship's important to us. People need to know that it's intentional that we do what we do. It's not by occasion. I think one of the ways that Satan gets us the most is to convince us we don't need to be here. I think one of the ways that he goes after us the most is to convince us we don't need to be here. Because he feels like, and you see it, if you just slip away a few times, and you miss a few times, and then a few more times, and all of a sudden, that old verse says you can get hardened or your conscience can get seared, comes into play, and the next thing you know, it's just easier to not be here than it is to be here. That's what Daniel was so strong about. And again, how long he'd been strong about it. Daniel's worship wasn't to defy the king's decree. It had nothing to do with that. Daniel's worship, that prayer was his custom. It was his routine, and it was intentional. And we need to think about that characteristic of Daniel, and we need to strive to also make ours routine and intentional. And again, just one of those things I just read through in my study of Daniel in the past. Verse 11, these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. I have the feeling that these people, and this isn't told us here, but I have the feeling that these people were just waiting. They knew what was going to happen. They were just waiting outside. They didn't have to stake out his house to know what was going to happen. He was there. They were there, so they were waiting. So they went immediately. So here's the tattle part of it. They went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. And I find it interesting that they begin by repeating what the decree is. They just want to remind the king in case he's forgot what's about to happen. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, yeah, this is true, according to the law of Medes and Persians, which I can't alter. So he's saying he can't alter that. We've already discussed that. So then they said, Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. So they tell him now. So they've told the king, all right, Daniel's violated it. 3 times a day he goes and prays. It's what he does. So just want you to know that, king. Here's the other thing that I found interesting in thinking about this. Because I reflected in chapter 2 about Nebuchadnezzar. Well, chapter 3 actually, about chapter 3 in Nebuchadnezzar. So when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were about to get, when they told Nebuchadnezzar that they had violated his law, and he was what? What happened to him? How did he react to that? First he tested them, and he said, no, we really did it. He was angry. He was angry. What did he do to the fiery furnace? What did he do? He made it hotter. He made it so hot that the people throwing them into the fiery furnace died themselves. Now look at this and contrast it to this king. When Darius, the king Darius, when he heard these words, he was greatly displeased with whom? Himself. I found that interesting. So we think about now we're talking about the second person. I said we're going to talk about 2 people and their characteristics. He was displeased with himself. I just have a feeling that a light bulb went off in his head. And he said, I can't believe I've done what I've done. It's a phrase sometimes I use when I get myself in a situation. I say, well, it's all my fault, really. I mean, it's all my fault. God calls me to be in this position that I'm in. And I think that's what the king's saying. I think he's displeased. I think he's saying, I can't believe that. I can't believe that. So that's the first thing that he said. He was just displeased. And then what did he want to do? What did he want to do? What did he immediately think? Did he get angry with Daniel? Right the opposite of Nebuchadnezzar. What he said, Nebuchadnezzar, he said to himself, he set his heart. When somebody says set their heart to something, what do you think they're thinking about? How would you describe somebody that set their heart to something? Complete intention. Sincere. He set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And how long did he work on that? All day long. So, think about that. This is a king that's been kind of set up, for lack of a better word. I think that's a fair word given his displeasure with himself. He didn't get angry. He immediately tried to figure out how to get himself out of something that he knew he couldn't get himself out of. So, that tells you something about the king, but it tells you something about Daniel. The king knew that Daniel was loyal to him. The king cared for Daniel. And he began immediately trying to figure out how to deliver him. These men approached the king and said to the king, No, king, that is the law of the Medes and Persians, that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So, repeat that again. Then I find the next verse very interesting. The king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But what did the king say? Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. So what did Darius know about Daniel and his faith? He knew he was a godly man. He knew that. I find it interesting because Darius, I'm sure, like Nebuchadnezzar and like all the kings, were polytheistic. They believed Daniel had a god, but they believed there were other gods. In fact, I think the clip I showed of the little still I showed at the beginning of the thing, they're worshiping, actually, that's Well, it's actually Nabonidus or Belshazzar's parent, but they was worshiping the moon god, so they believed there were other gods. But having said that, so you understand that they're polytheistic. He held Daniel's God in high regard, our true God. And he knew. Maybe he heard the story of Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego in the fiery furnace. I don't know. Maybe he did. If he did, it was many years earlier than this. But he knew that Daniel's God could deliver him. He had confidence in that. But, again, the same point. How did he say Daniel served his God? How did he say he served his God? Continually. Right? Continually. He served his God. He knows he's going to deliver him. He says that you continually served your God. A stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring. And when the signets of the Lord's, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. I found it kind of interesting here that everything was done according to the law. Darius did not back down from something lawful. He did everything according to the law. And I found that interesting. Even with his regrets of what he had to do, he did it according to the law, including sealing it. But the other thing that sometimes you read these verses and you see what's there, and sometimes I miss what's not there. And I don't know if it was omitted for a reason, but I don't think it was. I don't think it's just an omission. I think there's a point in it. What did Daniel do when this happened? He just complied. He didn't. There's nothing in here that said Daniel pitched a temper tantrum, or Daniel said, "Well, wait a minute. You know that there's another reason for this, or don't throw me in the lion's den." Yes, Don. That's it. That's exactly right. Daniel had no reason to object, because he had complete faith. And it says, later we'll see, it says that he was delivered because of his belief in God. Daniel had no reason to object. Yes, Gary. Yeah. Yes. That's right. Because it can never be altered. Once they made a law, it can never be altered. And that's the reason. So, yeah, I think Daniel just had such strong belief, he had no reason to object. And I think it's just, you think about what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say when they said, well, I'm going to cast you in this fiery furnace. What did they say? Well, our God can deliver him, and if he doesn't, so be it, right? I just think it's an incredible faith that Daniel had. And I think there was no reason for him to object, because I don't think he was worried. I think he was content with what the outcome would be. Either way, I think he would have been content with what the outcome would be. But that's something else just to see. It's something that's not there that would tell you something about what his character was like. So he's now been cast into the lion's den. And I want us to take a look a little bit about the king at this point. Think about the king. So we know he was displaced. We know he was displeased with himself. I think verse 18 and 19 tells us a lot about the character of Darius. Now the king, Daniel's in the lion's den. The stone's been rolled in front of him, or over the pit. It's probably a pit. And Daniel's there. It's been sealed by the signet. And the king, what does he do? He goes to his palace, spent the night fasting. So the first thing he did, spent the night fasting. There were no musicians brought in before him. And he couldn't sleep. His sleep troubled him. You can see what his demeanor must have been like when he went back to his room. this might be the way we might say it. Just leave me alone. I don't want any food. I don't want any entertainment. I just want to be left here. I am so troubled by this. Just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. Sometimes we think about this story, we think about the cruelty of Darius to be willing to do this. And we're going to see in a little bit, Darius did have a cruel moment in this whole process. But at this point right now, that's not the way he's feeling. He's remorseful for what he had to do. And he's saddened by what he had to do. Don't give me any food. Just leave me alone and come in. The king rose early the next morning and went in haste to the den of lions. So he got up early and he rushed there. And in verse 20 it says that he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice. He was in anguish when he got there. Daniel, I can just hear him shouting it. Daniel, servant of the living God, in verse 20. Has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? So you see what kind of character the king had. He was anxious about it. He ran to the tomb. He ran to the den of lions to want to make sure Daniel was okay. Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the mouth of lions, and they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. He was found innocent before God. Think about that. Daniel was found innocent before God. And I've done nothing wrong to you, king. That's that first time Daniel says anything. So he praises the king. See, I think Daniel understood the king had to do what he did, because he understood the law. Let's remember, he's in a position of authority, right? He had to understand. He knew the king had to do what he did. But he finally says at the end of this, King, I've done no wrong to you. And then the king, in verse 23, exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury was found on him, because, as we said earlier, he believed in God. Those who had set this up face a difficult thing, and I'm not going to go into the details, but because it could be a whole study. But they accused Daniel. Those that had accused Daniel actually died in the lion's den themselves, along with their families. And I want to make a point. Remember, this is the king's decree. This is not God's decree at this point. But the king chose to kill them and their families. But then I want to get to the description that Darius says about the God, about our God. I make a decree in verse 26. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. He is a living God, steadfast forever, a kingdom which shall not be destroyed. His dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers, rescues, works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? You see what he says about God? A living God, steadfast, a kingdom that will not be destroyed, a deliverer. Now think about this. That's where we sit today. We sit in that kingdom that can't be destroyed, the church. We're being delivered from our sinful lives. Isn't it something? King Darius' description of Daniel's God is the same description of our God, because it's the same. It's where we rest. Daniel continued to be prosperous as he continued to serve Darius. I want to end to serving Cyrus as well, and we'll have some chance to talk on that a little bit later. I just want to leave you with a few thoughts. We serve a powerful God to whom we should be loyal to. We need to distinguish ourselves among others. Peter says we should be peculiar people, a different people. Paul tells the Romans we should be transformed and not conforming to this world. We need to distinguish ourselves. We should strive to be blameless. our worship, and we've talked a lot about this, but I just can't emphasize enough, our worship needs to be intentional and it needs to be routine. It needs to be a part of our life. We just need to accept what God lays before us with the same kind of faith that Daniel has accepted. Things don't always work out the way we want them to work out, but we need to accept it. We have no greater example of that than Jesus, who prayed for something in the Garden of Gethsemane that God didn't grant him. Have you ever thought about that? In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed that let the cup pass from him, not to have to go through, we just have to go through. How did God answer his prayer? Sorry, but you got to go through it. Sometimes we face trials. We just need to accept what God lays before us. We need to give our glory to him, and we need to keep our focus on him. I hope that through the study this morning, you can see more from this chapter than just the guy that survived the lion's den. I think you can see something about the great character of Daniel and use him as an example for the kind of lives that we want to live. And that was my whole thought, to try to make this a little different than just the story. But I appreciate your comments. I appreciate your kind attention, and we'll get ready now for our worship service.